that we had, it was as if they were talking to somebody else, not the government, because the government returned back to Toronto, developed some amendments that made absolutely no sense compared to what we heard in the hearings. I can tell you, Speaker, we agree with the concept, Speaker, that there are two new ridings that are to be created. We understand why they're being created. We believe in that process of the creation of these ridings. But we wanted to hear from the people in the Mushkegowuk riding. We wanted to hear from them and hopefully get a better understanding of what it is that they wanted us to do on their behalf. And boy, Speaker, we got it with both barrels. You know, the two ridings, the Kiiwetinoong, which will be in northwestern Ontario, is going to be 68% Indigenous. The Mushkegowuk riding on the James Bay coast will include Hearst, Kapuskasing, and others, and be 60% Francophone and 20% Indigenous. They talk about Kiiwetinoong is the Ojibwe word for north, and Mushkegowuk, I'm reading from the government's news release, Mushkegowuk can be translated into English to mean people of the swampland. So we're talking about two Indigenous names, except to hear from the Grand Chiefs, as we did, the Mushkegowuk riding is not an Indigenous riding in their own words. They were quite shocked and quite surprised, Speaker. In fact, one of the Grand Chiefs, because they're going to name the riding Mushkegowuk, one of the Grand Chiefs said, well, we're flattered that at the name being used, but they're very surprised because they were not asked if it can be used, and it doesn't actually represent that area. It represents the area outside of Timmins as well, Hearst and Kapuskasing, and as I said, it's 60%. It is 60% Francophone and 27% Indigenous. So, during the hearings, we heard very loudly and very clearly from two Grand Chiefs, a chief as well as private citizens, who said using the name, and I'm quoting now, is misleading. This is what the Grand Chiefs told our committee. Using the name Mushkegowuk for the new riding is misleading. I don't want to paraphrase, but certainly throughout all the documentation we received from the Grand Chiefs, from the chiefs, and from the private citizens, I can read one example from Grand Chief Alvin Fiddler and Grand Chief Jonathan Solomon. Quote, the name Mushkegowuk must not be used for one of the new proposed ridings in James Bay region. This is from the Grand Chiefs, both of them. They go on to say the Mushkegowuk Council and NAN must be allowed to submit suggestions for an alternative and more appropriate name. This is what they're asking us. They have gone out of their way to ask us that. We sat for hours in front of the Grand Chiefs. They had about a half hour to speak and answer some of our questions each. There was one underlying theme throughout the entire day which to me was the purpose on going to Moose Factory, to listen to them. In this case, we listened to the Grand Chiefs especially, who were very, very clear over and over that they were not consulted. They told us that. Not in so many words, they told us in those exact words. They were not consulted on the name, and they certainly found offense, again, their words, in the fact that the name was being used without their prior knowledge or their approval. They termed it misleading. This is what we heard from them. They didn't like what they saw, they didn't like what they read, and they certainly did not like what they heard. Again, they said they were flattered, certainly flattered by the name. But I'm reading, Speaker, from my notes that I wrote. They told us there was no consultation. They did not, thank you, they did not see a draft. They only saw the final report. We heard, well, of course, the commissioners, they had a tight schedule. Well, the chiefs, too, were busy at the time. They talked to us about a trust issue. They said they found a lack of trust. They told us that they questioned the validity. I mean, I'm shocked, by the way, Speaker. These are some pretty harsh words that we heard. They questioned the validity of the Commission's report. And again, I'm not disagreeing with anything they have to say. We went there to hear what they have to say. It's what we did with this information that is most surprising, Speaker. So I'm going to continue for a bit talking about what we heard from them. We absorbed all of these notes from them. The mistrust, in their words, misleading. They said, this sounds as if, and I'm quoting again, that you're saying to them, we know what's best for you. This is what they found to be offensive. So we brought a motion, an amendment, that I believe and that our party believes respects what we heard from the Mushkegowuk Council. I believe and we believe that this motion, the amendment that we brought, respects the wishes of the Mushkegowuk Council and others, NAN included. And I'll talk about our amendment in a minute, but what I'm so shocked at is the amendment the government brought. I'll read you that amendment because it's so surprising that they brought this amendment. Government, in the first government motion, the first one, the Attorney General shall undertake a review of the name Mushkegowuk James Bay electoral district. This is what the government came away with. They're telling you as plainly as can be that they don't want you to use the name Mushkegowuk in a riding that has nothing to do with Mushkegowuk. They told us that over and over and over. For hours we heard that. And what does the government do? I'm expecting they're going to come back with an amendment that says as the Attorney General said, voices need to be heard. Well, we heard them, but they didn't do anything about it. In fact, they've added insult to injury here. Speaker, they've just expanded the name Mushkegowuk James Bay. This is their bright idea. Speaker, it's as if they were in a different room than the rest of us were in. For them to bring this, I'll compare that with what our amendment was, which I fully expected the government would have A, brought, and B, passed. Ours is, despite, this is under the Mushkegowuk electoral district, despite the provisions of this or any other act, the name of the Northern Electoral District identified in the schedule as Mushkegowuk shall instead have a different name to be prescribed in a regulation made under this Act by the Chief Electoral Officer. Subsection 4 does not apply if the Mushkegowuk Council provides the Chief Electoral Officer with written consent for the use of the name Mushkegowuk. So here we're saying, look, we heard you. You told us you do not want that name. In fact, they went so far as to say Grand Chief Jonathan Solomon, who represents 7 of the First Nation areas and bands, tells us, yes, the province wants to make significant changes, whereas the changes include the lands and communities of Mushkegowuk peoples, and the proposed new riding to be called Mushkegowuk misses the opportunity to create a riding that would give the Amishkigo an electoral population base for real participation, and thus misses an opportunity to move towards reconciliation and fails to recognize the self-government that the Mushkegowuk people have exercised from time immemorial and which was recognized in the oral promises of Treaty 9. And they go on to say, the proposed riding actually reduces the percentage representation of the Amishkigo as compared to the existing bracket inadequate riding, and therefore is a step backward rather than forward. They're telling us, as plain as you can hear, that they don't like what we're doing, Speaker. Therefore, be it resolved, this again is from Grand Chief Jonathan Solomon representing the 7 bands. Therefore, be it resolved that this 2017 Annual Assembly of the Chiefs and Delegates of the Mushkegowuk people urges that the presently proposed new Mushkegowuk electoral riding not proceed, and that before any electoral riding changes are made, I'm reading from his letter to the committee, real consultations take place in Mushkegowuk territory, and that a riding to be considered and implemented which represents the Amishkigo in our ancestral homelands and ensures the likelihood of the real Amishkigo representation in the legislature in the future. So they're very simple. And so we asked him, look, just in plain language, tell us, how long will it take to do this? And he said, 3 months is not enough. It might take 6 months to a year. But we said, yeah, but this is going to happen in October, maybe November. There's not enough time. And they told us they would rather wait out another 4 years than proceed with it in this way. This is what the advice was from the Grand Chiefs. They said, we want you to go back to the drawing board. That was the advice from the Grand Chief representing 7 of the...
Did they listen?
No, member from Timmins James Bay, you know as well as I do that this government did not listen. Instead, they bring out that motion, an amendment. They expanded the name. They added insult to injury. They did not remove the name Mushkegowuk. They just added another phrase to it, James Bay. So I'd like to read a few more quotes from the hearing. And these are quotes now. These are from the Standing Committee on General Government, the Hansard copy. We heard that using the name Mushkegowuk was, quote, alarming to the chiefs. We also heard, as I've said earlier, that while they're flattered the name was being used, they're surprised as they were not asked if it can be used. And they went on to further suggest that that be the case. They want to be asked. They want to be consulted. In this particular approach, what we've seen the government do is gone ahead, they've changed the name, they've expanded it, but Mushkegowuk is still in the name, and they still haven't asked their permission. This is what we went all the way, by plane and by boat to get to Moose Factory, was to hear what they had to tell us. We heard, but they didn't do nothing about it. Nothing. Nothing at all. In fact, what they did do was make it more insulting by adding to the name but leaving Mushkegowuk in it, so they still have not asked for their permission, which we heard 100 times, to use their name. What we're offering, what the PCs have offered in our amendment, is to consult with First Nations, the Grand Chiefs, the Chiefs. It's very clear. Our amendment that we brought forward last Monday, it didn't make it. Instead, the government, the Liberal amendment, to expand the name against the wishes of the First Nation, that one, well, they passed that one. That's the new one, Speaker. As shocking as that must be to you. I believe that the Grand Chiefs and the Chiefs were pretty clear that they were offended to see the name being proposed without their advance approval, and here we are, a week after amendments, 2 weeks after we were in the far north. This government has made precisely the same mistake that they made in presenting the name in the first place. But it's an insult, to use the words of the Chiefs, all over again. They're insulting the insult now. They've doubled down on the insult. I think that would be viewed, this second insult, more tragically, Speaker, than the first time, when we went there. When we went there to listen, and I can tell you from my perspective, I was not aware of their feelings, but within 30 seconds, we sure heard loudly and clearly, and by the end of the day, we'd heard it over and over and over. So, to go back to them now, I can't even begin to imagine what they must have thought Monday afternoon last week when the amendments were passed, that they doubled down and re-insulted them, just added a bit more to the name. As I said, we flew there, we took boats across the river, vehicles to get up there, we listened to them, and we came back in all that reverse order, the vehicles, the boats, more planes. And here we are again, listening to the Liberals. They did exactly and precisely what the First Nations was offended for in the first place. So we're back to square one, but maybe a little bit worse than square one. Had they left well enough alone, they only insulted them once. Now we've gone and doubled down, and here we go again. They've insulted them a second time.